From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
In the wake of the epic collapse of Curt Schilling's 38 Studios, Rhode Island taxpayers are on the hook for roughly $90 million. So when a recent auction of the defunct company's intellectual property grossed only $320,000, one could feel the collective blood pressure in the state spike. But with some items still up for sale and a lawsuit aimed at recouping losses in the works, all hope may not be lost. This week on Newsmakers, we get an update from the court-appointed receiver for 38 Studios, attorney Richard Land. Then, just this month, Pope Francis was chosen as Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Then he adorned the cover of The New Yorker as a snow angel. The new pontiff's message is resonating with millions of Catholics and non-Catholics alike, but his emphasis sometimes seems in stark contrast with other members of the hierarchy, including Bishop Thomas Tobin of the Providence Diocese. This week on Newsmakers, the impact of Pope Francis with Providence College theology professor Dr. James Keating.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. Good morning, everyone. Rick, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tim.
So there are a lot of aspects, a lot of tentacles, if you will, with the 38 Studios case. You have the lawsuit the state brought on, which you are not involved with, the bankruptcy proceedings, the politics. Explain, if you will, what your role is in 38 Studios.
My role is to sell off the assets that the state took as collateral for the loan. So essentially, we've got the computers and computer equipment that everybody understands the business ran with, but also the intellectual property, the game that was in development, all the old games that had already been marketed and sold. Those are still owned, in a sense, by the company. And so my job was to identify all those assets and try to find a market for them and sell them.
It's the intellectual property that I mainly wanted to talk to you about
Sure.
here. As we said in the open, there was a recent auction for that IP. It took in $320,000 for a couple of games. But the marquee product, the one that we all know about, that Project Copernicus game, it didn't sell. You said in a statement that there weren't any acceptable offers. What kind of offers did it receive?
Let me just say it this way, Tim. This is, as you described it, a marquee product. This is the idea, this was the development that the state of Rhode Island was betting on, essentially. And a considerable amount of the state's money and the company's money went into developing it, millions of dollars, $50 million, $100 million. And the offers that we got were so paltry related to the total cost of developing this product that it didn't make sense to sell it for such a small sum relative to the total value. That's not to say there isn't some value there, and we're continuing to work with interested parties to develop a future with this game and to develop some potential revenue streams for the state of Rhode Island.
Paltry. Was it insulting and was it disheartening to you?
I wouldn't use the term insulting. I'm not easily insulted or offended by these things.
Spoken like an attorney. I mean, it sounds like you don't want to give us an exact value.
Well, the problem with giving an exact value, I mean, we did get real offers. I don't want to mislead people. There were real offers. There were real dollars put on the table. But
$1, was that what we're talking about here?
I did actually receive an offer for $1, but clearly that's not acceptable. But when you look at the total investment in the product and you look at what's been developed, there's real assets there. Maybe they'll never be developed into what Curt Schilling and 38 Studios envisioned, but there's an opportunity there, and I think the opportunity outweighed the dollar amounts that were presented.
You mentioned, we're talking about the game, and the game is so important, but you took responsibility for every asset they had down to desks, right? The physical things that were, there was an auction block that day. How much money, Tim mentioned that $320,000 at the top. I know that came out of this more recent action. Is there a dollar figure right now of how much has been recouped from the auctioneer at the main building and everything else after legal fees and other expenses?
There are different aspects to the case, and there are different revenue sources. There are some I can't talk about just because there's still ongoing issues. But with respect to the auction that occurred last year of the tangible property, the desks, the computers, the total revenue from that, or the total recovery, was about $800,000. But only about half of that actually came into the receivership estate, because a lot of 38 Studios equipment, and particularly the newer equipment, was leased. And so the leasing company really received the benefit of that. But as part of an overall sale, it made a lot of sense to do it as one. And if you recall, we had a considerable amount of interest in a lot of bidders, and those assets sold for high dollar values. We still have some of the computers that 38 Studios used, some personal computers that were preserved for one reason or another, and we also have the servers that we need to use to maintain the games.
To just follow up on Ted's question, so the physical auction of the stuff, you said 800,000, but only really half of that. So are we at 720,000 right now? I mean, I do want to put a number on it here because we talked about 320. That was gross, so that is not net. The auction house gets what, 6%. So what are we? We're looking at less than $1 million so far.
Less than $1 million so far. And as I indicated, there are other revenue sources, but they're not. There's no certainty to them at this point. I would expect that we'll be over $1 million in aggregate recovery at some point, and then we have an additional sale of hard assets, the additional computers at some point as well.
One industry expert I talked to said that what you were able to sell was pretty much a completed project, plug and play, and the challenge is with Copernicus that it has a ways to go. Is he right?
I'm not an expert in the industry. I think it's fair to say that the game that was in development, Project Copernicus, has a long way to go to be finished, to be completed. My understanding of the project and the game is there's an opportunity to take parts of it and do things with parts of it without fulfilling Curt Schilling's total vision.
Did you consult with an industry analyst?
No, we've not consulted with an industry analyst on that point. I mean, there are lots of people out there who are making different comments. The folks that I've dealt with are the people who actually know what's been developed and have played parts of the game itself.
Okay, and I shouldn't have said analyst. I meant to say expert. They also said that there might be some concern with the buyers because Electronic Arts handled the first game, Reckoning, and those, that's the world, if you will, that Copernicus is based on. Is there some overlap with EA where they might lay claim to some of the IP?
Well, the IP that underlies the Reckoning game is owned by 38 Studios, and EA acknowledges that.
Okay.
You could not take that same IP and replicate Reckoning, but it's clear that a buyer of these assets could develop a sequel to it, so if they chose. EA does retain some rights, and in particular, it retains the right to continue to market and sell the Reckoning franchise. But
does that give buyers cold feet, you think?
I can't say. That issue did not really arise. It was not a question that the interested parties presented as critical. It's relatively clear what EA's rights are, and there's no question that they didn't retain any rights to develop Copernicus. That was absolutely clear.
And on the Reckoning, this is the original, the first game, a sort of a regular game that came out. EA was selling it. I assume there's still at least some stream of royalties from ongoing sales of that. Does that come into the receivership?
That is an issue we're continuing to deal with. Just to briefly, that the agreement with 38 Studios was one where they funded the development. EA funded the development of Reckoning. So until they recover their development costs, there's no actual royalties coming to 38 Studios.
And I believe that was like $25 million or somewhere on the order of that.
Closer to $34 million, and they have not reached that recovery yet.
That's a high amount of money to get to.
It is.
All right, this goes by fast, but I do kind of want to get, as we close this conversation out, in pun intended here, what's the end game and when is it? So what do you hope to see out of all of this from your perspective, and when do you think it'll be done?
Well, I'll say, to answer your question, I'll start backwards a little bit. I had hoped that the auction process would have resulted in a sale of all the assets. Clearly that didn't happen. I am continuing to work with interested parties as we speak, and my hope is that I will have some proposals that I can work with and make a decision within the next several months as to what the next step is with respect to the Copernicus assets in particular.
All right. Richard Land, Attorney Richard Land, who is a receiver for 38 Studios, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
My pleasure.
And when we come back, we're going to have a conversation about Pope Francis. Our guest is Providence College theology professor, Dr. James Keating. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, colleague, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. And our guest for the second half, Providence College theology professor Dr. James Keating. We brought him on because we want to talk about the first 9 months of Pope Francis. But before we start talking about him specifically, I want to get to the big news out of Rome this week, a shakeup with the Congregation for Bishops. Explain what that is and how significant it is.
Well, the Congregation for Bishops is part of the Curia, which is the papal administration, and they work in the name of the Pope, so they're very powerful. It's like a cabinet for the president. And what they do is they select all the bishops of the world. Now, they make recommendations to the Pope, but the Pope accepts their recommendations in almost every case. And there's been a major shakeup in the sense that the two most conservative cardinals, one of them an American, Cardinal Burke, has been not reappointed or been removed and been replaced by more moderate bishops, cardinals.
So what does that mean, when you take a step back? And specifically, I guess, what does it mean here? You think of Bishop Thomas Tobin from the Providence Diocese, and you think of him as sort of a more conservative bishop.
And a vocal conservative.
A vocal conservative, yeah. Could this impact him?
I think it has to. I mean, there's a way in which Bishop Tobin is sort of a typical John Paul II, Benedict XVI bishop, someone who boldly speaks the church's teaching and society. If you remember at all, John Paul II, one of his contributions to the Catholic Church was a certain boldness, right? And a certain just say it, say the truth, especially when this human dignity is on the line. And Bishop Tobin did his job, has been doing his job, right? He's been doing that. However, Francis has made the determination that the church needs a change of tactic, because the church had become really associated with the no's, so these no's on these controversial issues, which Francis believes are central but not essential, in the sense that you don't always have to talk about them, and they're not the priority. The priority is a message of God's forgiveness and love, which is the heart of the gospel.
I'm just curious, as a scholar of the papacy, what has been your reaction to the first 9 months of Francis? And is this what you expected when you heard the Habemus Papam and you saw Jorge Mario Bergoglio walk out in St. Peter's Square?
I don't think anyone expected it. He was known to be a man who would reform the Curia. The Curia had seen a lot of corruption and a lot of problems during John Paul II and then Benedict, and they thought Francis would come in and clean that up. I don't think people were prepared for all the other things that he did. Now, we've had this before. This is going back a little bit, but the change in 1958 from Pius to 12.
A little bit.
Yeah, well, not for papal history, but for 1958, he had a very regal, kind of quite conservative, traditional, almost a noble kind of character in Pius XII. And then you had John the 23rd. He's the one who calls the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah, Vatican II.
Vatican II, exactly. And he was a son of peasants, and he did a lot of these things that we see Francis doing. So in that sense, we've seen this before, but I don't think anyone predicted Bergoglio would do them all.
It was really, I think, and you're more the expert, but 5 words that stood out early on with Pope Francis, and it was, quote, "Who am I to judge?" And it was a response to a question about gay priests. I was interested when you said that these things are still important to the church, but it's not what he wants to be up front and center. What do those 5 words mean, you think? Does it mean he's saying homosexuality is okay with the Catholic Church?
No, I don't think so. However, you may know that not only Time named him Man of the Year, but the gay magazine, The Advocate, did as well.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they said that with those words, he changed the direction of this, hugely important, over 1 billion people, institution of the world. That might be a little bit too much, a little too optimistic from their viewpoint. But I think that his desire, that who am I to judge, has been taken a little bit out of context. But I think people heard what he intended them to hear, which is that when God looks at a person, homosexual or straight, he looks at a person. And that's how human beings should look at people as well.
Do you think that those words were calculated then? Because I think he made the comments on a jet ride. I mean,
yes, he did, yeah.
So to a reporter's question, was he planning on saying that, do you think? Or was it just sort of off the top of his head?
It's very hard to know with Francis. It always seems off the cuff, but when he repeats it, he says the same thing. So I think it was calculated. I think he was known in Argentina as someone who was very much opposed to the government's plan to allow homosexual couples to adopt. That is part of his makeup. He thought this was a very, very bad thing. That is a different position for him, as far as he's concerned, of how one should treat homosexuals. And I think that we're going to look back and see that Francis started the Catholic Church in a different direction about just how you speak about homosexual people, how often you speak about them, what you say about them. And he is very reluctant to bring together too much the politics of homosexual marriage and things like that and the people, right? And so I think that who am I to judge meant when I meet a person, I meet a person. I see them, I should see them as God sees them.
You're getting right to the heart of something I've been curious about, which is you hear, particularly from the traditional Catholics, New York Times had a big article about some uneasiness about Pope Francis right now. And one of the points they make is that he's not changing church doctrine. And as you just said, he's not saying there aren't gay marriages in Catholic churches all of a sudden or anything like that. It's about tone. But it sounds like you think tone is important, even though he's not changing, asking for the catechism to be rewritten. It matters that he's changing the tone.
The tone is extremely important. I mean, the church is a speaking church, right? It's also an acting church. It's a welcoming church. It lives in parishes, right? And so how are people welcomed in parishes? That's when Francis is speaking about those things. He's thinking about that. I would also say that there's also it's not we would say like priorities. Right, when we talk about politicians, well, popes have priorities. And so, no, he's not going to add another person to the Trinity or something like that, right? But he is going to change the priorities of the Catholic Church. And I think we're going to see that with the kind of bishops he's going to select.
Is he alienating a branch of the Catholic Church?
Yes, for sure.
How?
Yeah, well, we've had about 30 years of a particular style of Catholicism, which is kind of bold, kind of countercultural, focusing on some particular issues. Not that John Paul and Benedict never talked about economic injustice. They did, but they also spoke about these other things. And it had a whole generation of bishops and Catholics and even converts to the Catholic Church who were used to this style. And now along comes Francis, and he has a very different style. Not only a different style, but he also criticizes certain aspects of the previous style. So yeah, there are people. Cardinal Burke gave an interview last week, I saw, that he was very critical of the Pope, something you would not have seen with Benedict or with John Paul II.
And do you think someone like Cardinal Burke sort of has the gravitas and the history to say, I'm going to say whatever I want, I'm a cardinal and I've been around a long time. Yes. For Bishop Tobin, is it possible that the papal nuncio, the ambassador, the Pope's ambassador in America would give him a call and say, can you tone it down a little? Or, are the bishops basically autonomous once they are in their role in their diocese?
I think we saw that a little bit with, not to equate these matters, with the sex abuse crisis. Bishops are pretty autonomous, and they don't. Rome is not likely to get involved. But I think Bishop Tobin has made a few statements that have gotten him into a little bit of hot water, and he's a smart man. He can figure out
which way the winds are blowing.
Exactly, and change a little bit. Not going to change completely, but a little bit.
Another a very important person who we haven't mentioned right up north is Cardinal O'Malley, who was the Bishop of Fall River.
Yes,
he's now the Cardinal in Boston. And how important is he in terms of the people Pope Francis listens to? It sounds like he's quite influential.
Quite influential, yeah. He would be, there's eight advisors to Francis, and he's listening to them on virtually every issue. And he's one of the eight. And in fact, with the exhortation, he introduced it. Yeah, he's very influential.
There was some talk that Cardinal O'Malley could be the next pope, and I think I heard him say that being pope is akin to being trapped in a museum or something.
Exactly.
Is that his worst nightmare, you think, to be elevated to?
I would be curious. I would think that certainly was the case with, remember, John Paul started out as a young man in the papacy, but then died an old man, and Benedict was elected as an old man. Francis has done things a little bit differently, so it'd be curious to ask Cardinal O'Malley. Wouldn't tell you, but if you could ask him, he may think differently now.
Francis's focus is on the flock rather than the institution.
Yes.
He's drawing massive crowds. He gets in with the crowds. He's even removed the bulletproof glass on the Pope Mobile, if you will. And I loathe to even bring up this subject, but it's sort of the world that we live in right now. I imagine this must be a struggle for his security detail.
Oh, terrible.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I know a few people in Rome who have these connections, and they say it's a nightmare for these folks. Because remember, their idea, the security is to keep the Pope safe. It has nothing to do, really. I mean, it's his concern to get out amongst the crowd. It's their concern to keep them safe. And yeah, it's very worrisome. I mean, I remember seeing Benedict drive around, and there would be cars and cars, and then he would come speeding through as they stopped all the traffic. Francis just gets in a Fiat. Well, I don't think he drives. Someone else drives.
Yes.
He sits in the front seat, and they drive around Rome. And now we hear these stories that maybe he's going out at night and feeding the hungry. So,
do you see any actual changes on church policy or teachings coming down the line? As we said, tone is one thing. There can also be discussions. I know I've heard a lot about divorced and remarried Catholics. What do you see as potential areas of actual policy of the church that Francis might look to amend?
I would say there are two to look for. One is that, I mean, Francis has made it very plain that he would like the theologians of the church and the canon lawyers to figure out a different policy to how we treat divorced and remarried people. Now they cannot come to communion. A murderer can, but someone divorced and remarried can't, right? And there's a lot of those folks, as you can imagine, especially in Europe. There's a lot of those folks who no longer go to church, and so he really does want to affect that. And if a pope wants to change something, more likely than not, he's going to change it. The other thing is he's spoken about the idea of women having power within the church. He's spoken about a theology of women inside the church. Most of the papal reflections about women have been women in society, not so much in the church. And so I don't know what's going to happen on that matter, but he has said it, and once you say it, then the expectations build and something has to happen.
More generally, when you look at the trends in mass attendance or in seminarians going into the priesthood, obviously there was a big decline, as a lot of traditional institutions had after the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution of that era. Is mass attendance continuing to fall in the United States, or has it fallen down from where it used to be but leveled off? What are you seeing there?
Well, I mean, there has been a recent study where nothing's really changed since Francis has become Pope. But those studies maybe that's true, but those things are kind of hard to track. People could feel better about Catholicism but haven't gotten to church, or the people in the pews may feel better, more committed. So those are hard to know. The drop-off in seminarians that's leveled off. It's not what it was before the council. This is 1962, the council, but it's not where it was. It had really dipped. A lot of that, and this is the interesting thing to look for, a lot of that came from that kind of boldness and confidence infused in the church by John Paul II. And a lot of these seminarians and bishops, they're what we call John Paul, JP2 priests and bishops. And Thomas Tobin is definitely one of them. It's going to be interesting to see whether Francis can attract young men to leave what they need to leave in order to become priests.
And just briefly, it's Christmas. That's part of why we're talking about this. Is that going to be an interesting test to see if the pews are a little more full at Christmas? People are especially likely. My grandfather had some Italian phrase, Natalines and Pasqualines, for the people who only went on Easter and Christmas and took his seat. Is this a good test at the holidays of whether more people maybe come back?
Sure, why not? Yeah. I mean, I think so. I don't know how you would test it, because normally people just kind of eyeball it. But yes, and you hear people say it so much, it's got to be true. We know it's true in Italy, by the way. The mass attendance has gone up in Italy, because he's extremely popular in Italy. People going to confession is up in Italy. I could imagine something like that will happen in the United States. But as I said, that's not the only thing to look for.
He's the first Francis as a pope, correct?
Yes. Right.
Why was that not a popular name? And is John the most popular?
John's the most popular name, yeah.
Why was Francis not popular?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, other than most people didn't want to get involved with Francis Assisi. I mean, especially in Italy, most popes have been Italian. Francis is considered, another Jesus, an alter Christus is what they call them, And the idea of sort of taking on, I'm another Francis, is, those are big shoes.
What was the message then you think the Pope was sending by choosing that name?
Right.
That he wants to be another Francis. right? I mean, there's two ways to look at sort of Catholicism. There's what I would call the Benedictine way, which is that's the monasteries, and you sort of set up a sort of a Catholic world and invite people as refugees to come into it. That's more Benedict XVI. Then there's the Francis way where you go out into the streets. And I think that's what he's doing.
Dr. James Keating, theology professor from Providence College, thank you so much for joining us on the program. From everyone here at Eyewitness News, have a happy and safe holiday and Merry Christmas. I will be off next week. This guy is going to be in the hot seat. Don't mess this one up.
That's right.
I think there's a vacancy, so any politicians that want to come on the show next week, feel free to do so. If you missed any of the program, it's online, WPRI.com. For Ted Nisi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.